Hello, everyone. My name is Uwe Brandis, Associate Dean and Executive Director here at Georgetown University. And welcome to the second of our Part 2 inaugural speaker series that we're using to help launch the program in urban and regional planning at Georgetown. We've had a very distinguished set of speakers join us in the fall, primarily focused on public sector challenges in the Washington, D.C. metro region. And this spring, we turn our attention to professional challenges, challenges in leadership, challenges in innovation that present themselves to urban planners today. And we kicked off with a great session last week with Marilyn Taylor and Alex Krieger, Gary Hack, and Mitch Silver. And today we move forward, and we're delighted to have Michelle Moore with us to really take us on a journey of leadership and leadership challenges. Michelle is a former White House political official and social enterprise entrepreneur who helped build the U.S. and global green building movement as Senior Vice President at the USGBC, the U.S. Green Building Council. McGraw-Hill has called Michelle a relentless agent for change. Michelle has developed and launched a new global climate programs for the Clinton Foundation, created multi-billion-dollar public-private partnerships for the Obama administration, and cut red tape and bureaucracy to get legacy infrastructure projects built. Michelle is a board advisor to Groundswell on how to use social enterprise business models to drive social change, and a senior fellow at the Council on Competitiveness on Infrastructure and Energy. She is an advisor to Delos Living and the International Well Building Institute. Now, Michelle has a Bachelor's of Arts from Emory University, but I'm very, very excited to announce that Michelle is our first Georgetown graduate as part of the speaker series. Michelle was a graduate of the School of Foreign Service. Michelle's been a trusted colleague for many years, and I'm very excited that you're here today. So please, welcome to Georgetown.
Good evening, everybody. I'm thrilled to be here this evening, and thank you so much for the invitation to come and speak. A couple of other things I want to share with you about my bio that are pertinent to the topic that I want to discuss with you all this evening, which is really about some new models for leading change against some very old problems, very old challenges. In addition to being an MSFS graduate, very proudly, one of the things that I discovered about myself when I was working on the White House for the past 4 years, that fundamentally I am an advocate and I am an entrepreneur. And I'm also from a very small town in Georgia. I'm from LaGrange, Georgia. It's a textile town. And in terms of my connection to this industry, my connection to sustainability and some of the topics we're going to talk about, I came to them living out my worst nightmare as a Georgetown student, which is going back to my hometown and working for a textile company, a carpet company, actually, after I graduated. But it was Interface Inc. It was for Ray Anderson right after he took on the challenge of being the first sustainable company in the world. And so that really got me on this path. So given the community of folks I'm addressing this evening, I had to share that little nugget. But as I shared, one of the key things that I really took away from the time that I served as federal environmental executive and a senior advisor at the Office of Management and Budget at the Obama White House is that I am an advocate and an entrepreneur. And that's something that's quite different, as I learned, from being a member of the government and for having governing responsibilities, as I know many of the people who are represented in the audience here do this evening for the cities and, in some cases, the states for which they work. Some other challenges that I ran into, some other assumptions that I was disabused of in going into the White House and having responsibility for sustainability of the administration. I thought that somewhere there would be a button that I could push to get a full report on what the energy consumption was of the federal government as a whole. That's something that many private sector companies have. That's something that I know is being discussed downstairs. in work that cities are doing to lead disclosure standards, but that button wasn't available. In fact, energy reporting came from people typing on computers in Excel sheets from printed utility bills. So that data, the transparency, and the information that was available was very, very different. Another assumption that I had coming into that role is that being in a leadership forum, being at the White House, which was responsible for setting policy direction from a national perspective, I wasn't prepared for how challenging the environment would become broadly from a political perspective to lead change from inside the federal government, particularly coming as I did from an industry in the real estate, building, and design and construction community, which had effectively led a very successful self-regulation program over the past decade to boldly lead, to courageously lead into some new territory on energy and climate. So the three learnings that I wanted to address with you all this evening as fundamental to a different way to see a change model, a different way to approach a change model as a leader in government, a leader in the private sector, or a leader in the nonprofit community is, number one, commerce and culture create change. We're at a point in time in our history right now as a country, certainly, where from a national perspective, it is much, much more challenging to drive change if you're in the federal government. Many more opportunities for leadership at the local and state level. So number one, commerce and culture create change. Number two, technology drives transparency and transformation. A lot of the technology tools that we have now, be they tools for transparency like my magical energy consumption button if I had had it, or whether we're talking about social media and the ability to connect very quickly with other people who have shared values, is absolutely transformative in terms of its ability to build constituency, drive campaigns, and connect people very, very quickly to action. And number three, and this is particularly important for those folks in the room who are representing city and state leadership, innovation and institutionalization of change really begins with cities and states. Cities in particular, but also states, have very importantly different abilities to direct action from an executive perspective. You know, they're close enough to their populations to be able to engage directly with the citizens. You know, if you look at a lot of polls on topics like infrastructure, whether we should have a national infrastructure bank, questions like that, folks trust their local leaders more than they trust their national leaders. So city leaders and state leaders are in incredibly important positions to be able to drive transformation. So with those three things in mind, and one other overarching concept I'd like to ask that we kind of hold in mind as I'm sharing my perspectives and then as we get into the Q&A, there's also a fundamental difference between transactional and transformational leadership. Now, what I want to talk about mostly this evening is transformational change. You know, how can we face up to the systems issues that we're addressing, like energy efficiency, climate change? What about urban water? How do we deal with resilience in our infrastructure? What about long-term planning processes? You're thinking about 20, 30 years out. A lot of politicians are thinking about 2 to 3 years out, if that. You know, they may be just thinking about a 24-hour news cycle. You know, as leaders who are long-term thinkers, who are strategic, who are purpose-oriented, how do you drive transformational change over the long term? So the basic change model that I want to present to you, based on my experience, that I want to back up with a couple of examples before we transition to Q&A, is a change model that works roughly this way. Again, with those three principles in mind: public-private partnerships as a fundamental building model for driving change and against very challenging issues that are led by local or state, or local and state actors joined together at a regional level that create proof of concepts against particular policy solutions that can then be driven up to national policy, where there's a necessity for scale, where you need to be able to build a national market, or where you need national rules of the road for the market to operate effectively. And those are all goals from a policy perspective that private sector, that public sector, that the NGO community can all work for together. So I want to share a specific example of that a lot of folks in the room, whom I recognize, were involved in. And that's the Better Buildings Challenge. And it's one that I had the good fortune of being involved in personally during my federal service. Now, the Better Buildings Challenge is addressing energy efficiency. And as urban planners, and as the broader real estate design development community, energy efficiency is something that we all deal with, whether at the building level, at the district level, at the city level, or more broadly than that, where we're thinking about utilities and utility companies. But energy efficiency has traditionally been very, very challenging to go after for a variety of reasons. Number one, it's highly fractured. Millions of commercial buildings, more than 100 million homes in the US. Most of them are already built and operating. How are you going to get in there and make sure everybody's utility bill is a little bit lower and that we're consuming less? It's a very challenging problem. As many of my colleagues have described in the past, it's one in which you need silver buckshot, not silver bullets. And in the past 5 years, we've been operating in an environment where, from a national political perspective, there was still debate over whether something called climate change even existed. So to be able to, in that absurdity, to be able to focus on what the real societal level challenge was, to be able to drive energy efficiency policy is something that just wasn't possible from a practical perspective. And oh, by the way, there was also no money available to get it done. No money, no political capability. Hugely important problem, tremendously passionate and smart people working on it. How do you unite around a goal? So, thinking about the ideas, the change model that I discuss, starting with public-private partnership. Like in any industry, there's a roughly 80-20 rule. You have 20% of the folks who control about 80% of the resources. So, the way that we approached the Better Building Challenge was to use what the federal government had a lot of, which was technical expertise at the Department of Energy, and political convening power at the White House to be able to bring together a group of leaders from the private sector, from city government, from NGOs and other institutions to make specific commitments to create change. The metric that we used was 20% energy efficiency improvement by 2020, but we also decided, very importantly, to count dollars. Because thinking about a public-private partnership, markets marshal demand, markets marshal investment, and being able to demonstrate momentum around that idea, momentum that you could make money solving these problems, that you could do well by doing good, that a policy mandate was not your only solution. That was really the floor, and the business opportunities were the ceiling, was a way that we worked to move forward. So at the end of the day, we were able to create a public-private partnership that had no policy mandates behind it, that required no additional investment of the federal government, that required no permission from Congress, which was tremendously important, but that brought together $4 billion in investment in energy efficiency with no additional cost to taxpayers, and that brought together more than 250 million square feet of aggregate real estate commitments by large companies, many with recognizable names, by universities, and by cities as well, who brought in their unique power and authority over their own municipal buildings and over local building codes to help create momentum and solve a market problem. Now, that change model had effect not only in terms of what our near-term policy goals were, which was to reduce climate pollution, cut energy, cut costs, and create jobs, making that economic linkage. It also helped to build a credibly important bridge between the private sector, local leaders, and national policymakers at the Department of Energy. 3 groups that had not necessarily worked together very closely before, not on the same problem at the same time, towards the same goals anyway. And that program, the Better Buildings Challenge, has not only proved effective in reaching its near-term goals, it's also been effective in creating a conversation that's helped to re-engineer in some fairly fundamental ways the way that the Department of Energy thinks about interacting with the private sector to drive energy efficiency, because that detailed level communication matters with that long-term perspective in mind too. So that's the Better Buildings Challenge. And that illustrates primarily public-private partnership. I want to cast forward a little bit and share how that could be leveraged into creating local and state level proof of concepts that could be driven nationally to drive broader change. Because these are some conversations that may be happening now, great conversations among the Sustainability Directors Network towards these ends, but the community that was created through the Better Buildings Challenge would also be in the position to help inform important conversations like how do you innovate around disclosure policies for the real estate community so that from a technology perspective, you're using data and transparency to inform markets and drive more transformative change over time, and then use national policy as a tool to create a level playing field so everybody's literally speaking the same language, but doing it in a way that's informed by your private sector participants, that's informed by city governments who are ultimately the customer, and that are really asking the federal government to only intervene and act where it's useful for the rest of the marketplace, working together to move the policy forward. A second example I want to use, and this illustrates more the power of technology and transparency to drive transformation, is around infrastructure and infrastructure projects. Again, as the community of folks who are represented in the room today, getting big stuff built, not just homes and buildings, but community scale projects, utility scale projects, water and sewage treatment systems, roads, transit hubs are all problems that we will all face. And they're tough to get built. Historically, there are lots and lots of examples of very good ideas, even very good ideas that have good funding behind them, that have taken anywhere from 3 to 5 years or 3 to 10 years even to get through the federal permitting process. Now, I personally believe that our environmental protections that drive those permitting processes are incredibly important, but as a business person, as an advocate for sustainability, as a person who believes and has experienced fundamentally that you can do well and also do good, nothing should take 10 years, especially not in this day and age. 3 years is even kind of pushing it. We need to be able to move much more rapidly than that to maintain our competitiveness and to be able to address some of the huge challenges that we have together, like addressing resilience. Climate change is underway. What are we going to do about it so that little cold weather doesn't stop all our Amtrak trains and too much rain floods all our homes? So, infrastructure. One of the challenges that I took on when I was at the Office of Management and Budget was leading an initiative that the President launched with the Jobs Council to cut timelines for about 50 high-priority infrastructure projects. They were very diverse, ranging from transmission lines to bridges to transit hubs and ports and waterways. They were big, like the Tappan Zee Bridge, $6.5 billion investment. And they were incredibly challenging in that they involved sometimes a dozen federal agencies in permitting processes with very cross-cutting goals. Again, a little sidebar, something else that I learned in my federal service is that everybody has different statutory mandates and sometimes they're at cross purposes and there's really nothing you can do about that except for be a really good negotiator. And in addition to those dozens of federal agencies that were involved, there are also tribes, state governments, local governments, public utility commissions, and every single one of these projects was incredibly important to their, to the community, to the economic competitiveness of the region, to jobs. They were things that people who were the neighbors actually wanted to get built, even if they wished they couldn't really see it from their backyard. So, looking at that challenge, how could we solve it? In that particular case, public-private partnerships weren't necessarily the best solution, although better communication was critical, particularly among the government actors. State government, local government, federal government don't always communicate well around these projects, and improving that chain was incredibly important to be able to plan and move forward. But data transparency was the critical gap. For multi-billion-dollar projects, you would expect that you should be able to go on a dashboard somewhere and get a picture of where it was in the permitting process, who was responsible, what their telephone number was. That's not actually true. Unfortunately, that's not where we were, and that's not necessarily where we are today. So the critical intervention in solving that public policy challenge was transparency, using technology to be able to create a simple dashboard that gave a sense for all players involved, public and private, what was the schedule, what was the timeline, who was responsible, was their email address and telephone number, and to have everybody signed off and moving forward together. It's from a private sector perspective, certainly for the younger folks in the room, for whom technology has been fundamentally a part of your life since the day you were born. That probably sounds so dead simple it sounds dumb. But data, technology, and transparency can drive transformative policy change for challenges like that have been with us and will continue to be with us for a very long time. The last example that I want to use, it really illustrates innovation and institutionalization is beginning with cities and states. And that is just the story of the U.S. Green Building Council and the LEED rating system, because I think that's something a lot of folks don't appreciate about that who are familiar with the technical program is how extraordinarily important the people are on that process. The success story of green buildings and sustainability and LEED in this country and abroad really is about the people. And it is particularly about people at the city and state level who help to drive that transformation. Little known facts, when LEED was developed a little more than 15 years ago, close to 20 years ago, shortly after USGBC was founded, it was a great technical idea that was focused on solving a very challenging problem, but it was also a tiny 7-person nonprofit organization located in Washington, D.C., with no revenue and very little philanthropic support. $400,000 check from the Department of Energy helped to get LEED going, and that's what that organization lived on for quite some time. But it was an idea that really connected with a sense of mission and a sense of purpose of a lot of important people in architectural firms, in city governments, and nonprofit organizations, in developer organizations, general contractors around the country in a way that was relevant to their values. Some people cared about climate change. Some people cared about the quality of the natural environment. Some people came from communities like the one that I grew up in. They loved to hunt, loved to fish, cared about the quality of their rivers, and LEED was a way that they could connect their job responsibilities directly to a value system, a sense of purpose that they held as an individual. It brought more meaning to their work, and they became advocates and helped to build the program out. And the work in particular that was done at the city and state level to create model policies, to drive adoption of green building standards through schools, through municipal buildings, through federal buildings ultimately as well, helped to create a business case that the private sector was able to follow. It helped to create a concrete sense of what the cost and benefits of those programs were. And through policy incentives, it helped to buy down the cost premium of adoption of a new technology in a way that enabled the market to move much more rapidly. And that ownership of an important idea by the community writ large, and the extent to which state and city actors were able to develop model policies that were able to be adopted by their peers around the country and ultimately modeled at the federal level in tax incentives and other programs, enabled us to go as a nation from having absolutely zero green buildings to having more than 10 billion square feet in green buildings registered and certified in less than 20 years, which is an extraordinary accomplishment given how challenging the built environment is to address, since you have to hire a small army even to get your kitchen remodeled. With that, I'd like to conclude with just a couple of thoughts on extraordinary challenges that we're facing now as urban planners, as city policy leaders, as nonprofit advocates, as business people, that could be very interesting to apply this rough model of change to. Financing of infrastructure projects is not just a looming challenge. It's something that city governments in particular are facing every day. If you read the American Society of Civil Engineers annual reports, we're up to a D+, yay, in terms of grading our infrastructure. That's a little bit better than we've been. I think we've been at F and D- in the past. We've got a $1.4 trillion funding gap. We've got shrinking federal budget. We've got gas taxes, which are really user fees. They don't go to the general fund. They directly fund roads and transit projects. that haven't been raised in more than a decade, maybe more. And so we have bridges and roads that are falling apart. We've got transit projects that are incredibly important for urban communities that aren't being built. We've got private sector leaders who want to invest in these projects through PPPs, public-private partnerships, through their pension funds, and somehow the system is still at a complete logjam. So that's a problem that needs extraordinary, innovative thinking that's transformational, not just transactional. Urban water systems. I have to imagine that's been a topic of conversation by our sustainability directors who've been here today as well. Too much water, too little water, climate change makes it all worse. We've got floods, we've got droughts. We've got beer in California that can't be produced because they've had no rain. There's beer, it's gotten serious. So, how can we apply new change models to old problems in urban water systems to get the transformation that we need? And lastly, and I've mentioned this throughout the conversation so far, and that's the challenge of resilience. Resilience. If we're building buildings, if we're building infrastructure, if we're planning our cities, if we're rebuilding roads and bridges, we've got to do it in a way that matches natural challenges, climatic challenges that haven't been present in the before and that are hard to predict for as well. If we're rebuilding roads or bridges or train tracks on Metro North in New York City, if the water rises, those tracks are really, really close to the water's edge the way they are today. And, we have a system of environmental protections in this country that can make it very challenging to rebuild something any differently than it was built the first time. So how do we face that transformational challenge in a way that not only gets us where we need to be from a resilience perspective in time, so that it doesn't take 10 years to get to a yes, and that we can fund and finance, since our budgets are shrinking, and we're challenged with where the money is going to come from, to be able to meet our needs. So with that, I would conclude my thoughts, and I would open it up to questions and to comments as well, particularly since a lot of folks in the audience could be up here giving this talk that I'm giving today with even more extraordinary examples. One little note too, as I have been admonished by my Georgetown colleagues, if you don't talk into the mic, it doesn't show up on the video. So if you have a question or a comment, raise your hand. We'll get you a mic, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks, Michelle.
So I was downstairs with the sustainability group, and one of the things we were talking about is confusion. And so from the private sector, I look at government programs and I go, some of them seem to overlap and maybe even conflict with each other. Mm-hmm. So I want to ask a very specific question. You have Energy Star, they have the National Building Challenge, and you have the Better Building Challenge. So how are those things different, and why do we need multiple programs?
Great question. So I'll share my own experience with this and similar. I'm coming from more of a corporate entrepreneurial background. I'm used to having the latitude, if you're in the leadership component of an organization, to be able to say, oh yeah, let's put these things together. And that's not how it works in the federal government. It's probably not how it works in state government in many instances as well. You have programs like Energy Star. You have programs like the Department of Energy's Building Efficiency Program that are defined by statute. So it's literally the law of the land. And those two organizations are also funded separately. So they're appropriated separately, and there is no latitude to blend those funds. It is actually illegal to blend those funds. So from a federal perspective, there's a lot of work that goes into what I call paving over the cracks. There are a lot of meetings, and there are a lot of interagency working groups and steering committees that try to constantly keep programs together that are sometimes funded in the tens of millions or even billions of dollars, staffed by hundreds of federal employees, thousands of contractors, and you've got a group of 8 people at the top who are trying to keep the trains running roughly together and on the same track. So I'm not current and can no longer speak on behalf of, but I can tell you at the time in which that program was formulated, that all of the agencies were brought together to determine how everyone can best contribute, and DOE could lend its technical expertise, and EPA could lend its market knowledge and its extraordinary program in Energy Star to help to move the market forward. I think that if there's, from a private sector perspective, my best suggestion would be to just appreciate the constraints in which federal colleagues and government colleagues from other sectors work under as well, since it's literally illegal for them to put their budgets together, and try to be very specific in any asks that you make about what the agencies can do to work together better. Because the business logic and some of the organizational decision-making structures that exist inside the government they're so different from they are in the private sector, it can make it very hard to understand one another, especially when you have senior career leaders who've been in government for a very, very long time, maybe have never worked in the private sector. Bridging that communications gap is tremendously important. The intentions are good, but in many cases, when you're talking about the federal government anyway, it's like 1983 up in there. Compared to the technology that you have. Like I was in Ronald Reagan Airport last week, and one of the billboards is, does your kid have better technology than your company does? And it's probably true, unless maybe you work in some of the really cool parts of DoD. But I would just suggest that you keep that in mind and understand that there's a limit. Everybody wants to collaborate, but there's some very particular ways in which they have to do it, given their statutory lanes. Other questions and comments?
I spent some time in California recently, and one of the things that I realized, or one of the things that I observed, was the use of energy as sort of a job creator. Mm-hmm. There was this program down there where guys were retrofitting houses with solar panels.
Right.
So do you know of any examples where the energy sector is certainly being used as an incubator for those type of initiatives for workforce development?
That's a great question. And actually, I would invite some of my colleagues from California who are in the room, who lead in these areas, to pipe up and add comments and add to what I have to say. But it is absolutely true. Energy efficiency, energy retrofits, installing solar panels on homes, on commercial buildings, is a job creator. You cut costs, you save energy, and you create jobs. Interestingly, it's often kind of a hard sell because of utility companies don't make money if they're saving energy, except in California. California, the energy companies have the right kind of incentives. So getting them at the table helps a lot too. But if you're thinking about not just residential, but also commercial, the federal government and many state and local governments have been leaders in this area as well. And the specific type of product you would want to look at is called Energy Savings Performance Contracts, ESPCs. And ESPCs are mostly used by the public sector and institutions like hospitals, schools, universities, that are capital constrained. And because ESPCs basically let you finance upfront construction based on guaranteed future energy savings. So you're able to fund the projects off the balance sheet, so to speak. And government institutions have actually been a real leader in this area. And it's a proven job creator. It's proven and documented to cut energy costs as well, because it's literally baked into an investment grade audit that underpins the whole deal. Would anybody like to add to a great story about these programs? Yep. Okay, all right. Another question here.
The energy problem is tied to a political problem.
Yes.
If you could put a political toolkit together to translate some of DOE's ideas to give to constituents, what would it be in your toolkit?
That's a really good question. That's a hard one too. I don't. It would be difficult for me to come up with what the right top line message is standing up here this evening, because all your best ideas about that kind of stuff are when you're like in the shower, right, or over a drink. But and I would actually go a little bit further upstream than that. I think that in terms of what the message would be, it would be less about tools and more about the big idea of energy. I know that I'm 41, I'm a child of the 70s, but I and many other people remember Schoolhouse Rock, right? Yay, there are lots of other people laughing, and I'm not alone. But Schoolhouse Rock was really about culture. And I think that when we're talking about energy efficiency, when we're talking about understanding and valuing what our contribution is to our community and what we use, how we consume, that's a culture issue. That's something people learn when they're kids. That's something people absorb through their experience. And it's not a technical problem. I think oftentimes energy, sustainability, health and wellness, all of these ideas get treated, there's going to be some technocratic solution for them, or it's an intellectual problem. Well, most people don't make decisions based on, intellectualized analyses of challenges that they face every day. People get hooked emotionally. It's about your heart, not your head. And so if I had a magic checkbook and complete control for a day, I would really look at that question. How can I engage the American public in a meaningful way with their heart, not their head, to change the framework in which they see energy as a national problem, and then use that as leverage to drive political transformation. And true to the change model I was discussing, I would start in a diverse bipartisan group of cities and states, regions, where you had vocal political leaders who were great spokespeople, and go there first. Because if you can prove that it works in purple states, if you can prove that it works in a red state to blue state, and then you have a prayer of being able to scale up a policy solution at the national level, at least in the political environment that we're in right now, where Washington isn't really able to move much, period, and certainly not really able to move on problems that aren't completely plain vanilla and something that everybody wants to do everywhere, and sometimes not even then.
Michelle, as moderator, I'm going to take the license to ask a question, and then we can get on to some of the other questions. I was really struck by your comment about how the example of the lead rating system, but I'm sure it's not just that, I'm sure there are many examples like this, gave particular additional meaning to people doing a job, whatever it is that they're doing, wherever they fit into industry or the marketplace. Now, we, of course, are very biased here in thinking about cities and local communities as the place of innovation, as a place of leadership. Can you reflect about not just examples of where someone has been given more meaning in an individual job, but where those leaders themselves have communicated the innovations that they're working on up? So some people call this managing up, there are different words for it, but there's so many incredible innovative projects, innovative ideas really being born in communities across the country. What would you tell those people that don't see themselves as domestic policy rock stars, who see themselves as just doing good work? What obligation do they have to tell their story, and what opportunities are there associated with that?
So there's something that Ray Anderson used to say, or used to talk about, was the power of one. That every individual has an extraordinary amount of unrealized power, especially when it's backed up with their passions. And that's true regardless of where you sit or stand, and no matter what your job title is. And a key to being able to being an effective communicator, to being able to get your message and your story across, is really empathy. I think that's back to a little bit of what I was talking about before with sustainability and energy and climate community often have a lot of really beautiful technocratic solutions that nobody can hear past about the seventh word, because they don't have that kind of empathetic hook. You don't necessarily understand that where someone sits is where they stand. You have to know who you're talking to. And if I think about sustainable buildings, if I think about the local food movement, if I think about the peer economy, if I think about the extraordinary work that's being done in developing purpose-centric organizations around the B Corp movement. All of those ideas are ideas that began with very passionate people who put together a business plan, and either as a nonprofit, a for-benefit, or a profit or a for-profit organization, were able to begin to build momentum that had revenue behind it, or were able to take their ideas as public policy leaders, up the chain. And I think that a great manifestation of that, if we're talking about city leadership, is the fact that there are such things as urban sustainability directors today. Because that's not a title that necessarily existed 10 years ago. And thanks to a commitment from the Rockefeller Foundation, there's a new push to have resilience officers as well. People who are charged with thinking about hard, long-term problems and can work across silos in their organizations. So there are a lot of heroes. There are a lot of heroes regardless of what movement we're talking about. And I think it is appropriate to characterize them as movements, because it's not about technical solutions. It's not about how your head engages with these issues. It's about how you're able to hook someone's heart, and that begins with an empathetic response to understand who they are, where they sit, and how you need to engage them through your passion.
Hello. My question is more about sustaining the infrastructure of our country, and you said that the budget for the United States is like very little or small and maintaining and shrinking. And I was wondering how much do the companies that benefit from the existing infrastructure, whether it's waterways or railroads, contribute, or roadways, the shipping industry, the train industry, contribute back to maintaining the stuff that they use to make profit in the first place?
So it's a great question. It's a little bit of a complicated answer. And it sort of depends. I'm sure if I were an economist, which I'm not, I could give you some fascinating algorithm about how investment is paid back in taxes and blah, blah, blah. Whatever, I'm not an economist. If you're looking at where funding for infrastructure comes from in this country, a lot comes from the federal budget, but cities and states actually pay more. Cities, especially through municipal bonding authority. And for private sector companies, many of them do actually invest directly in the infrastructure that they need. I heard the CEO of Siemens talking about this. This country our manufacturing sector has been doing okay lately. It's been kind of coming back. And so foreign companies in particular want to invest more in their manufacturing capabilities in the US. But that investment can't realize any return if you don't have the ability to give enough trucks and rail lines and Panamax vessels into ports to be able to move goods and materials around the country or internationally. So Siemens had actually built out the railhead that was necessary to get more product in and out of their manufacturing plant, and that had benefited their neighbors in the community as well. But it's actually really hard for private companies to put money into infrastructure for a variety of reasons, including some quirks in the way that the federal budget and many state budgets are done. There's such a thing called budget scoring, and because the United States budget is only passed every year. It's like 1 year, and then it's if there's not going to be another budget ever again, and then it's the next year. And so unlike private sector companies, we have no capital budget. So if you have a future obligation in year one, you have to take the full hit in year one. It's a little bit geeky budget stuff, but it actually is a huge limiter on private capital flows into infrastructure projects through PPPs. And what I've seen is a lot more interest and engagement on the part of investors in wanting to put their money into U.S. infrastructure because it's a good investment. With the exception of Congress going crazy every once in a while and making threats, we pay our bills. And it's a good bet. It's especially a good bet if you have long-term money, if you're a pension fund and you're thinking far out into the future. But it's also hard to find the right projects because there's not a level playing field to be able to determine, okay, well, where's my best investment? And then because of the lack of transparency, in part, for a lot of our very important environmental protections, but very dated ones in terms of how they're operated, there's a lot of political risk, is what you'll hear. Because I don't know when this project is going to get approved. I don't know if someone's going to sue. I don't even know what their decision criteria are. How can I put my money in that? You've got to give me 5% more returns. And all of those factors conspire to make it very difficult to move private capital in. And I think as public policy leaders and future public policy leaders in the room, you also have to ask yourself, okay, where's the responsibility for the public good? Because if my state or my city's critical infrastructure investments are being driven by a private company who may have good intentions but just doesn't have visibility, to know what's good for the community at large, then the money might not be going into the best place. So again, you need to think about public-private partnerships, not just as an investment vehicle, but as a planning tool, so we can get our infrastructure back into a place where it needs to be, nationally, but also locally. I'm so glad I got to talk about budget scoring.
You might get to talk about them a little more.
Yay!
So just speaking of what you just were the challenges of the private sector investing in infrastructure, would you say that it's more feasible at the state or even regional level versus federal? And a follow-up question or context to that question is, I know HUD and other federal agencies have been investing in regional plans. So would there be an opportunity to go past the planning stages into the implementation with public-private partnerships on the regional level?
Very astute questions. I think, number one, looking at public-private investment vehicles would be much more feasible at the local or regional level than at the national level. And you see that in the whole conversation that's played out about a national infrastructure bank. And some of the polling that I've seen in focus groups, talking to regular people about a bank, their reaction is, great idea, it makes total sense. I don't trust the national government to determine what's the most important thing to invest in my community. So thinking at a local or a regional level may have a better connection to citizens as well. Again, that idea of scaling up innovation. And there's some interesting work that's going on that front. The West Coast Infrastructure Exchange, which is being led out of it's Oregon, Washington, California, and I believe they've been very, very nice and reached over the border to our friends in British Columbia. And they're thinking regionally. And they're also working to solve some of the big challenges that they're running up against that make it hard for everybody to work. So they're really being great members of their community. So absolutely on the public-private partnership part. Second part of your question, can you refresh my memory?
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes, the Georgetown colleagues are going to yell me if I say, absolutely, I can hear you okay.
It was just on that note of with HUD and other
Oh,
agencies
HUD, yeah,
investing
the
in
plans being
regional
able to be
plans.
scaled up.
Mm-hmm.
The answer is probably it depends, whether or not those regional plans would be able to be built up and built out. The ones that HUD funded through their Sustainable Communities grants, the $150 million that went out, there was a very diverse group of communities who responded to those, some urban, some rural, some metro areas, so it's all sorts of different scale. And scale matters in terms of capacity and capability. So, just based on my own experience, you may have some units that were creating plans that would be too small to have enough economic scale to be able to leverage into developing public-private partnership vehicles. But an interesting question would be to look at the overlay between places like, or stuff like the West Coast Infrastructure Exchange, what the city of Atlanta, has tried to do in this area, and where you have these growth plans to see if there's enough overlap to be able to, as my colleague Nate says, can you find a pony in there? And you might find a few ponies.
Excuse me. As these public-private partnership vehicles are being developed, do you see that nonprofits are stepping up in that role of kind of filling that capacity until these things are in shape or are kind of moving along?
In some cases, there are foundations that are stepping up and providing philanthropic capital or startup investment, like angel investment, if you would, to try to get them going. The Rockefeller Foundation, Ford Foundation, I'm both aware of investments they've made. Kresge has done some incredible work looking at resilience, helping to develop the knowledge base. And so, there is absolutely a role for the NGO and the philanthropic community to play. Ultimately, if we're thinking about, our $1.4 trillion infrastructure challenge, and greater than that, if you look out into the future, you really have to mobilize big capital to be able to, solve that problem over the long term. But the building blocks that we have right now, which is some engaged private sector leaders, who are already kind of feeling the pain, if you will, and have experience in their manufacturing capacity being constrained by lack of infrastructure. Mayors, who are vocal and who are on the front lines of these challenges. They're on the front lines of resilience as an infrastructure challenge too. You've got committed NGOs and philanthropic capital who are willing to make strategic investments, where there are market gaps to be able to help folks get across the line. And you've got the promise, maybe potentially, if enough business leaders, of enough people who have jobs in somebody's district get mobilized to challenge Washington to think more transformationally about this, then there is a solution that's possible that gets us where we need to be, but it will take public-private engagement, public-private partnership in many forms, local and regional innovation, and folks engaged in that process who have a long view, so they can plot that not just, I'm going to do great in my region, but and I'm going to leverage my regional story to go hit somebody over the head in Washington and make them make a better decision next time.
Last question.
Just a quick question on the cultural aspects of leadership and so forth. You spoke about it at the very beginning.
Mm-hmm.
Since you're from Georgia, this is probably more related to the South, regional type of planning type question. I was wondering if there's like a cultural breakdown within leadership for change management, et cetera. If you had some kind of some insight how to deal with like local, city, and state government, how to deal with those leaders to ensure that we are able to actually make the change that we need.
So, from thinking about the role that culture plays in leadership and transformation, two thoughts I would share. One, certainly cultural ideas are powerful. Ideas that we own, that we think of ourselves as part of, and it's an adjacent space. It's not the built environment. But I think that no one need look any further than the marriage equality movement over the past decade to see how incredibly powerful culture, and cultural memes are to changing people's minds. Even changing minds that have been very, very entrenched for a very, very long time. When we talk about culture in the workplace and culture in working from public-private partnerships, there is an important role, as I was sharing, related to Uva's question, and empathy. My own personal experience is that there's no conversation that's too broad to, no gap that's too broad to bridge in communication. You may not agree, at the end of the day, but you can at least come to a common understanding. But it does take a commitment to listening and understanding the perspective of the person on the other side of the fence. Because state, local government, different regions of the country have tremendously different maybe not different values, but different ways of expressing those from a cultural perspective. Green building, sustainability, sidewalks, local food, whether you want to be able to live locally and be off the grid because you don't want to be dependent on any government institution, thank you very much, because you don't trust the government. Or because you want to be independent and off the grid and eat locally and, eat what you kill, whatever, because you really value sustainability and you want to minimize your footprint. Different perspective, same outcome. You just have to be prepared not to judge somebody for why they care about an issue. But I think that there's, from a government leadership perspective, there's something else that I think that we all have to understand and take into our workplaces, and that is, it is more important to share power than to have power when it comes to getting stuff done. In government positions in particular, coming from a DoD tradition, there tends to be a very hierarchical leadership structure, like thou shalt do it because I said so. And that doesn't work. Number one, it doesn't work because you don't know everything. And that's true no matter who you are and how smart you are. And also, these problems are too big to be able to implement transformation straight down a reporting line. You know, you have to be able to build mind share across organizations, across silos, across industries, across different communities. And so to be able to very mindfully, you know, as you approach your leadership responsibilities, understand how to share power, you know, how to get other people enrolled in your issues, and to be able to give away the credit and say thank you, for God's sake, you know, is an important part of being able to get not just good stuff done, but transformational good stuff done.
That's such a perfect ending. Thank you so much for joining us here today. We hope this won't be the last time.
Thank you.
And please join me in thanking Michelle.
Thank you, guys.